Good evening. I'm Robert Harden, the director of the Sumter County Library, and I want to welcome you to the opening reception for this exhibit celebrating the 400th anniversary of the King James Bible. The King James Version of the Bible has been a great influence in the development of the English language. It ranks with the complete works of Shakespeare in the Oxford English Dictionary as one of the cornerstones of the recorded language. After Shakespeare, the King James Bible is the most common source of phrases in English. The King James Version was translated by 47 biblical scholars working in 6 committees. It was first printed in 1611 and was not the earliest English translation of the Bible. It was predated by several other partial or complete translations, notably John Wycliffe's translation in 1382 and William Tyndale's in 1528. What raises the King James Version above other versions of the Bible in terms of its linguistic impact is the fact that the language used has persisted into the present day. Many of the phrases are still commonplace. Manifold Greatness, the Creation and Afterlife of the King James Bible, a traveling exhibition for libraries, was organized by the Folger Shakespeare Library, Washington, D.C., and the American Library Association Public Programs Office. It is based on an exhibition of the same name developed by the Folger Shakespeare Library and the Bodleian Library, University of Oxford, with assistance from the Harry Ransom Center of the University of Texas, to mark the 400th anniversary of the publication of the King James Bible. The traveling exhibition was made possible by a major grant from the National Endowment for the Humanities. 40 libraries nationwide received grants to host this exhibit and plan programming around it. Sumter County Library was one of the 40 chosen and the only location selected in South Carolina. Full credit goes to Dolores Pringle, who volunteered to write and submit the grant on behalf of the library. And I want to thank and acknowledge her for doing this. Dolores is in the back, so thank you very much for bringing this to Sumter. I also want to recognize 2 library staff members who have worked very hard helping to organize the exhibit and programs. First, over there videotaping is Ford Simmons, our Reference and Information Services Coordinator, so thank you, Ford, very much. And Brandolyn is sitting in the back. If she'll stand up for just a second. Brandolyn Love, she's been working very hard organizing this as well, so thank you very much to both of you. I also want to acknowledge the Sumter County Cultural Commission for allowing us to use Patriot Hall for some of the upcoming programs, and the Sumter County Museum for lending us some family Bibles from their collection to put on display. These Bibles are located in the front of the library near the front entrance, so this evening after our panel scholars discussion, if you would like to go up towards the front if you haven't seen them already, please do so. I also want to thank the Friends of the Library for their support in general, including their sponsorship of the opening reception and providing refreshments through Sisters Catering. Dr. Valinda W. Littlefield is an Associate Professor of History and Director of the African Studies Program at the University of South Carolina, Columbia. Dr. Littlefield earned her BA at North Carolina Central University in both political science and history. She earned a PhD in history with her major field in African American history since 1815 and minor fields in U.S. National and History of Education at the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign. Dr. Littlefield is the co-author of a 3-volume anthology, South Carolina Women, Their Lives and Times, and is completing a manuscript on African American rural Southern women school teachers during the Jim Crow era with the working title, I Am Only One, but I Am One, Southern African American Women School Teachers in Black Freedom, 1885 to 1954. We have with us Dr. Harry H. Singleton, an Associate Professor of Religion and Theology at Benedict College. Dr. Singleton earned a B.S. in Statistics from the University of South Carolina. He also earned a Master of Divinity from the Morehouse School of Religion of the Interdenominational Theological Center with a double concentration in theology and the Old Testament. Dr. Watson earned a Doctor of Philosophy from the Graduate Theological Union, Berkeley, California. His books include White Religion and Black Humanity, as well as Black Theology and Ideology. And Dr. Watson, as I said, is past Sharia for space, so hopefully he should be here shortly. Dolores is pointing and putting a thumbs up, so he must be on his way in right now. But Dr. Larry D. Watson is an Associate Professor of History at South Carolina State University. Dr. Watson received a B.A. in History and Political Science from Millsaps College, Jackson, Mississippi, a Master's in Education from South Carolina State University, and a Ph.D. from the University of South Carolina in African American History, United States History, and Early American Literature. Dr. Watson's scholarly papers include Martha Schofield and Elizabeth Evelyn Wright, Women Founders of South Carolina Black Colleges, History as Stories, the Art of Teaching History Through Field Studies, and The Cotton Club, Jim Crow Comes to Harlem, 1920 to 1933. So now with Dr. Watson arriving, I'm going to turn things over to our scholars panel.
For what I have termed one of the most unusual topics that in my theological career I have had to lecture and discuss. Usually as a theologian, the discussion is about the impact of the Bible on human relationships in general. But I have never lectured on a particular translation of a Bible and its anniversary. But in many ways I feel gratified to have been selected to talk about not only the King James Version, but any living reality that has endured the test of time. And the King James Version of the Bible has indeed endured the test of time and is still enduring it. As Robert said in the introduction, I did my Master of Divinity at the Morehouse School of Religion of the Interdenominational Theological Center in Atlanta. And my first week of class in my philosophy and theology class, my professor, John Diamond, did his doctorate at Boston University with Dr. King in the 50s, spotted a King James Version of the Bible on the desk of one of my colleagues. And when he did, he picked it up and quickly threw it out of the window. That was my first exposure to the critique of the King James Version of the Bible as we moved into contemporary times. Now the reason I say that is because it's a great place to start and work my way back. Language has always been a two-edged sword in the history of the church. And the King James Version of the Bible, Robert also mentioned in the introduction, had its way paved by two men in particular, William Tyndale and John Wycliffe, who both were executed, actually, by the church. And their crime was seeking an English translation of the Bible where the church had declared Latin from the 4th century and Jerome's Latin Vulgate to be the official language of the church. One of the things that emanated from that and what became a problem for Christianity, good problem to have is that when Constantine, of course, converted to Christian faith grew exponentially. It got its big break beyond the Roman Empire. Well, when church leaders committed themselves to the Latin Vulgate and Latin as the official language of the church, you then had a problem with growth. You had a good problem with growth. Anytime you grow, it's good. The bad problem is it was growing into areas of the world where people didn't speak Latin. And so as a result of that, it created a huge confrontation throughout the world where Christianity was between the leadership of the church and the laity. And of course we see that come to full blossom in the Protestant Reformation itself. And Luther, of course, saying, I am not trying to be a heretic, I'm trying to be a good Christian. But I got people in Germany wanting a translation of the Bible not in Latin but in German. And they should have a translation in their native language. And so we're dealing with language not only in terms of context, but as we move to the King James Version, we're talking about language too, in terms of preference, even within languages themselves. But of course, Wycliffe, even prior to the Reformation, sought an English translation of the Bible as Christian faith made its way into English-speaking countries. And of course, he did the first full English translation in 1382, which even predated Luther and the Reformation itself. That was a very radical move on his part. And so we have our first full English translation from Wycliffe as early as the 14th century. And of course, in the early 15th century, we see the church come out and condemn the translation. Why? Not only because it was not Latin, but because, if you can imagine this in a Reformation era in which we now live, it was too accessible to lay people. And of course, the church leadership was concerned that parishioners would go out on their own and try to be ministers themselves and not allow the clergy to handle all matters divine, of which one of the biggest ones was biblical interpretation. And of course, his reward for that is that he is brought before the Inquisition. The sentence of death is brought upon him. And of course, as we move 4 years after the Reformation, Luther being excommunicated in 1521, we move into the late 1520s. And of course, here comes William Tyndale, who tries to relive the heritage and the spirit of Wycliffe. Of course, he begins and completes our first New Testament translation from the original Greek. So, in that regard, Wycliffe was fluent in Latin, but not in the original languages, Greek and Hebrew. And of course, Tyndale, as we move up out of the spirit of the Reformation, begins his translation from the original Greek itself and completes it. And he is on his way to doing the Old Testament from the original Hebrew text itself. And of course, he finds himself being arrested, brought before the Inquisition, and sentenced. And so these two men paid a huge price for us to have an English translation of the Bible, and really created a little more tolerable atmosphere as we move into the late 16th century and into the 17th century and the King James era. The interesting thing about King James is that he was king of both England and Scotland. And a lot of people don't get a chance to do that in a lifetime once, let alone twice. He begins as king of Scotland in 1568. He becomes, of course, king of England in the early 17th century, of which, at that time, he orders, Robert said 47 scholars, to my knowledge 54 scholars. We won't go back and forth about that. He orders them to do a translation of the Bishop's Bible to be used in the Anglican Church. And so the King James Version is not a translation per se. It's not a translation from another language per se. It is a transformation into a different type of English. It's the better way to articulate it. One that was poetic, and one that in James's mind, as he commissioned the scholars, I want a Bible that would give us a smoother read. So as we read today, as I was just reading the 23rd Psalm and saw all of the verbs that end in S now end in ETH, and the U's and the I's and the thous, and gave it a greater fluidity. And that fluidity has stood really the test of time. It by far is not only the best-selling Bible, but again, it deserves its place because of its literary endurance. And not too many books, even scriptural books of a translation, can survive 400 years because there's always a push on to translate scriptural books into the contemporary language of that time. We have that problem with Buddhism and Hinduism, with the Vedas and Vedic language itself, which was written in a contemporary language at that time, Sanskrit. But of course, you talk to the contemporary Buddhists today, and it's like, we don't speak Sanskrit anymore. The old terms in Sanskrit, and they speak what is considered a contemporary form of Sanskrit. And so there's always a push for innovation. I was at 3 or 4 stores today, technological standpoint. I'll give you an example. Looking for audio cassette tapes. And I went to Best Buy, I went to Kmart, I went to Walmart, and all 3 of them told me we have no more audio cassette tapes, because we have moved into the era of the compact disc. The problem is that I am still using my lecture recorder that carries audio cassettes, and they have not made, in this technological era, portable recorders for CDs. It's the bulk ones for institutions. And so I am still looking for audio cassette tapes, realizing that I have clearly moved into the era of compact discs. And of course, one of the clerks told me to hold off on even those discs because now we're moving to Blu-ray. And they may become obsolete now. So you might see people getting dubbing machines to move their CDs and DVDs to Blu-ray DVDs and CDs now. So she said you may want to hold up on buying a CD recorder. But I finally found those audio cassettes at another Walmart. And the clerk told me, you better get them because we probably won't get any more in ever. And so, as is the case in technology, when it comes to literary forms, much is the same. We're constantly pushing ourselves within our disciplines to be creative, to write something that blows the previous stuff out of the water. There's a constant push on us as scholars to not only recognize what has gone on in the field before us, but to make our own unique contributions in our own way with our own thought. The same thing with language as well. It is constantly changing, it is constantly moving. New words are being added. We don't speak the way that we even spoke in America 100 years ago. And so for a literary book, and more particularly a scriptural book, to have withstood the test of time in that regard is nothing short of remarkable. So I want to stop there, give Larry a chance to weigh in as well, and get any feedback that you may want in terms of questions once we begin our discussion of the book itself. Thank you.
acoustics of this.
Okay.
They'll work.
Well, let me start by saying good evening. And I do sincerely apologize for my lateness. I actually feel a bit wobbly because I just flew 9 hours from London to Dallas last night. If you ever flown across the Atlantic Ocean when the jet shakes more than you think it should, then, you don't feel too good. But you feel good when you get here. But there are some moments. So that's my disclaimer. I want to thank Dolores for inviting me out. Dolores, thank you so much. I know your hands are there somewhere. I know that. And I can always tell. And I want to thank my colleague, Dr. Singleton, for that introduction. There's a lesson to be learned here, though. When you get to a place late and someone that goes before you, there's always the risk that they're going to say what you're going to say. So then you have to find yourself editing your notes at the same time so you won't bore the audience with any redundancy. So I hope I can avoid that. And so having said that, let me just say that I'm not a theologian, I'm a historian. And so my discussion is primarily historical. And I want to talk about this from a historical standpoint. And I hope you will indulge me. Now, Monday, I am going to be discussing Dr. King's use of the King James Version of the Bible. And he's very, very good at that. And I've got a collection of about 10, 15 of his speeches that we're going to excerpt. It's going to be like class. That's another problem I have. I'm a classroom teacher, and I have this classroom variant. So if it looks like I'm looking at you, I really am not looking at you because I don't have my glasses on. I'm just staring at the audience with I see all these figures out there, and I know you're there. And unless you move, I won't know any different. But I want to talk about the King James Version of the Bible in terms of historical framework, because I think that's how we got it. And I think Dr. Singleton for framing that. And I'm just going to add a few things, and then I know there will be time for some discussion. I have a couple of theories, that we're just going to throw out there, and I'll develop 1 or 2 of them, and then we'll see what you think about them. Here's my first theory, my first comment. The King James Version of the Bible is a direct result of the movement toward the development of strong nation states between the 13th and 15th centuries. Between the 13th and 15th centuries, European states began to emerge from their middle-aged doldrum and began to assert themselves new strong leadership. In other words, a new attitude of nationalism developed. And Harris touched on that a little bit when he said that the German people wanted the scripture in German. That's nationalism, of course. So part of this, one of the reasons why we get this new version of the Bible, and I haven't gotten England yet. That's a really funny story to get to England on this. But it is part of this movement toward nation building, especially as these 4 Western European states began to assert some independence from Rome, from the Roman Catholic Church. The church had always been heavy-handed, and had been pretty much under more direct control by the French and the Italians and the German states, such as they were. But the Spanish and the French, they sort of controlled it. And if you're an Englishman, and you don't want your church to be controlled by Spain, not really, or influenced unduly, I may add. The church had, however, been very, very successful in holding this whole thing together. In fact, the word Catholic means universal. So the Catholic Church, the Christian Church, is synonymous. Any deviation from that is heresy. The heresy, of course, could be very painful, as you know. And there are lots of heresies. Man is a very interesting animal. He thinks about things only in human terms. And so when you deal with this whole issue of Jesus' divinity, for instance, it's mind-boggling. The idea of an immaculate conception is mind-boggling because man has no base for that other than the single belief that faith alone determines that. So there are some things that people will question, and the church did not want deviation from this doctrine as long as there was one set of scripture, as long as there was one source controlling it. You could, to a certain extent, control what people thought. But once you disseminate that information, give other people opportunity to assess it themselves, you invite deviations. And that's what we're going to see happening. So as these nations began to assert themselves, Spain, Portugal, the English, the Dutch, they began to want their own version of the Bible. At issue then were some other things that played into this. For instance, the very nature of the priesthood was always a question. Who are these people who say that they are descendants of the disciple? It's like, who are they? I mean, what is their claim? What makes them different from me, other than the fact that they perhaps control knowledge, because they control the way the information is disseminated? What is their direct or indirect relationship to Jesus? These are questions that are being asked, and there are people who will ask these questions and will get people to listen to them. The other question that comes into issue here is the importance and value of man's role in his own salvation, this whole issue of faith. Later when we get to this hardcore Calvinism and we start talking about this whole issue of predestination, how many got familiar with this concept of predestination? There's another great poem that's beyond the period I'm dealing with today by Michael Wigglesworth called The Day of Doom. It's a very disturbing poem, and my college kids can read it. My high school kids cannot read it because it will disturb you. Older people might not sleep at night either if you read it. It's a massive poem. But in this particular poem, Wigglesworth, he discussed this whole issue of predestination, the doctrine of the elect, the fact that your faith is predetermined, that you can't do anything to change it, that you are locked in, and the whole issue of questioning that, in terms of if God knows everything and he's always present, then he already knows how things would turn out. And you can't change that, because that would suggest that your God changed his mind, would suggest that he made a mistake, and he does not make mistakes. And so this eats at you. So this whole issue of predestination gets into the value of man. In other words, can one influence God's decision? But the other issue here that I think that fits into this whole issue of King James Bible is central to all of this is the Bible itself. The Bible itself. Could the Bible be, can it be, should it be the sole authority on the faith? Should it be it? Especially since we know that man has been tampering with it. Men make mistakes. So when men get involved in this process, how can we be sure that we have the original and we lose things and gain things in translation? These become issues. In the 3 centuries that Dr. Singleton mentioned before the King James Version came out, many high-profile people, religious people, questioned this. Among them were John Wycliffe in the 14th century, John Huss in the 14th, 15th century, Martin Luther in the 15th century, and even people later in contemporary such as Zwingli will get into this discussion. And the most fearful of all of these Protestants, John Calvin, in my estimation, John Calvin and even John Knox and Tyndale, these people are raising questions and they're gaining audiences. Each would articulate an argument in their own language. Each has to communicate in the language that they have. Of course, you've got in this, you have Germans, you have French, you have English, you have Germans, and they want to speak their own language. Each therefore represents this whole issue of nationalism, and they were aligned with their particular states. That's why I say this is a period of nation building. Typically they did this, and they did it in a way that they wanted to win the mass to their position. We all know that Martin Luther won converts and then changed his mind and then abandoned them, then came back. It's a very interesting thing how Luther plays his life out. The English, of course, were not unlike the rest of these. The English I suspect that I just came back from England and I got a big heavy dose of English culture last week or so, and I came to a new appreciation of it. The English were an extraordinarily inquisitive people. They had a previous translation, but there was several versions of the scripture circulating in England. There was the so-called Bishop version, the so-called Geneva version. Then there were Latin. I mean, there were just so many there. What we don't often talk about is this. Queen Elizabeth realized this problem before she died, and actually was trying to create a single version, a so-called authorized version of the Bible. But that was not a priority for her. It was on her agenda. It was not a priority, but it was on her agenda. And perhaps had she lived longer or had few other things to deal with, she might have had it made it happen. But she died in 1603. Without an heir, we could have a long discussion about Elizabeth and her resilience. the joke among English people of the time frame was that Elizabeth was king and King James was queen. That's been discussed any further. I won't. But Elizabeth, who was much like her daddy, a strong personality, and by some estimates, England's greatest ruler of all time. An argument could be made for that. But at any rate, Elizabeth would have done this had she lived, but she doesn't. She dies, of course, after a very, very glorious reign. And she is succeeded by her distant cousin, by way of the House of Lancaster, Mary the Scots, and James the Scot of Sixton. James the Sixth of Scotland comes to England as James the First, and so in 1603, he came in with quite an agenda. This James is he does require some discussion because he has some Tudor blood in him, but nothing like Elizabeth. Listen to this by James II. I would like to throw him. I mean James I. I would like to look at him more closely. He is the son of Mary, Queen of Scots, the woman who was in prison for more than 18 years in the Towers of London and then killed by Elizabeth. Elizabeth thought a long time before she killed Mary, but she did the right thing. But this is my editorial. This is what historians say. I don't know if it was the right thing to kill him. He was the indirect descendant of Henry VII. He was raised as a Protestant, although his mother was Catholic, because that was the arrangement. James believed that he was a divine monarch, feeling that he should only answer to God. That was very typical of this time frame. It's a little bit early for, say the Sun King of France, but this is the era of divine monarchs. These rulers who believe that they have only one person, one source to answer to, and that is God, and not the people who they govern. And James buys into that too. He is a contemporary with Shakespeare, John Smith of American fame, Walter Raleigh, and some other big people. He is the king. He is the king who would be in power when Jamestown colony, when the Virginia colony is settled, and Jamestown would bear his name. Interesting, James realized something about 400 years earlier than the rest of us, and that is that tobacco is bad for you. He tried to stamp out the use of tobacco when he was king. He said it was bad for the heart, bad for the lungs, and bad for the breath, and some other things. And then in order to do that, he put a tax on it, and I guess that's still with us, because we still tax. It didn't work, of course, because everybody used tobacco. As you know, the men smoked it, the women did the snuff, the toothpaste. It was just a very, very fashionable thing to do. In 1604, however, James, realizing that he had some things already on the plate, one of which was the Bible, which was Elizabeth's idea. James, who is a very intelligent person. When I read about James, I hear about how smart he was, a very intelligent person. James established a committee of, I'm just going to say 40 plus, because the original call was for something like 55, I believe, and they say 47 showed up, but then they don't know who worked on it. They divided the work up among these committees, and they had these rules that they were all to follow. They had about 15 hardcore rules. These are the things that every little subcommittee must do, and those rules dealt with the things that they would maintain to the other versions. So they had to make certain that there would be some unity, some uniformity here. So James established this committee of 45 plus scholars and other stakeholders, some of whom were Puritans. At least 2 or 3 of these people were Puritans. These extreme Protestants who felt that the Anglican Church wasn't clean enough, had not gotten rid of enough of its Catholic vestiges, and eventually gave up on any salvation for the Anglican Church and decided that they need to start a new place in a new world. And of course, you know, a lot of them wound up in America after they had gone to the mainland and became even more evangelic in their faith. But at any rate, James appointed this committee, and this committee was to exhibit a tremendous level of consistency as they revised the old versions of the Bible. Because James said, and I'm quoting, that he wanted a Bible in the English tongue. And that's a very nationalistic statement. He wanted an English Bible. He said he read the rest of them, they were no good, and he wanted one for the English people. Because he's English, and he believed England is glorious. So this is back to my original point of nationalism. He wanted a Bible in the English tongue. In 1605, a group of Catholics who did not favor James attempted to kill him, and other members of Parliament. This was the so-called Guy Fawkes conspiracy. Of course, it failed. He wasn't killed. 1607, Jamestown was established. James authorized the revision of the Bible in 1604. 1611, the authorized translation was out. Now, the authorized, and some people actually just refer to it as the authorized Bible. It's gone through many revisions. 2 or 3 that came within the next 20 years. But for the most part,